Good morning, everyone. My name is Caitlin Haas. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. I wish it was in person, but I am really grateful to Sister Edward for having me present to you today. Um, we are going to be speaking about intellectual disability and misperceptions in the classroom. Um, I am one of three amazing advocates with the Rising Together Alliance. If you haven't heard about us yet, we are a nonprofit underneath the Foundation for Catholic Education, and our mission is to promote inclusive education for our students, grades pre K through 12, so that our students with intellectual disabilities can be included in their regular classrooms along with their families and friends. So my name is Caitlin Haas. I am a registered nurse with a background in pediatrics, and I have been very lucky to have many years working with students with or patients with Down syndrome throughout the years. Uh, I'm also an advocate with the Rising Together Alliance, and I am a mom to five little kiddos. My fourth of which is Lily, who happens to have Down syndrome. She's 2.5, and she is the reason I am here with you today. We also have Susan Schuler, who's an amazing advocate. Her son Michael will be going into his freshman year at Archbishop Carroll. He'll be the first student to be included in an inclusive education alongside his peers. And Vicky Sosek, her little girl is Abby. She is 3.5, and she is over at Mother Teresa Regional School in King of Prussia. So, really briefly, I just wanted to go over the Individuals with Disabilities and Education Act, IDEA, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It has 14 different categories of disability. Sometimes this could be a little bit confusing, so we just wanted to show you that intellectual disability is its own category. Autism is its own category as well. Dyslexia, which we often see in our student population, falls under a specific learning disability, and ADHD qualifies under other impairments. But in the future, if you ever get any paperwork from the Archdiocese or from RTA, please know that when we're asking for intellectual disability, we're specifically talking about ID and not necessarily autism or another diagnosis. So, what is an intellectual disability, right? Um, Underneath DSM-5 criteria, an intellectual disability has to have three of the following. You have to have a deficit in intellectual functions, such as reasoning, problem solving, abstract thinking. Um, you don't need IQ to define intellectual disability. Um, IQ testing is actually very controversial, particularly in Down syndrome, because it's very speech based and doesn't really capture, it's not very accurate in Down syndrome. But that could be its own talk unto itself. You also need a deficit in adaptive functioning, just having issues basically adapting to the environment and the world around you. And it also has to occur in childhood, so before the age of 18. Intellectual disability accounts for about 1% of the population, and of that 1%, 85% have a mild intellectual disability. So examples are Down syndrome, that's our biggest one that we see in our population here in Philadelphia, Angelman, Fragile X, PKU, as well as birth-related injuries. So here are some of the reasons why we're here with you today. These are our students, current and future. We have about 6 students currently enrolled throughout our schools, throughout all 5 counties of Philadelphia, but we also have many up and coming. So these are the beautiful faces that we're hoping that you're going to be seeing in your school if you haven't already. So if you leave with one thing today, I really want it to be this. There are a lot of misconceptions surrounding all intellectual disabilities, but today we're going to be speaking particularly about Down syndrome, just because that's our largest population that we're seeing who wants to have a fully inclusive education in our parochial schools. And that's what my daughter Lily has. This is my daughter Lily. So we're just giving you the parent perspective, but this can really be applicable to all sorts of intellectual and regular disabilities as well. Um, if you leave with one thing today, I really want it to be this. A majority of the issues you see in Down syndrome are misinterpreted as a cognitive impairment when really it's a symptom or a sign of another underlying issue and not really so much an indication of their cognitive ability, right? So if a person with Down syndrome has difficulty hearing, it's often misinterpreted as a comprehension problem. And if they have a difficulty in speech, it's often mistaken for a low cognitive ability. But what's really going on is that there are issues with motor planning and sensory processing issues, but it's not, in the majority of cases, not an indication of their cognitive ability. So if you live with one thing today, please make it this. These difficulties are not a reflection of intelligence, but rather a reflection of their difficulties with sensory processing, or motor planning. I think we really need to unlearn this. We're kind of taught this from the very beginning, that people with intellectual disabilities have a low cognitive function, but in actuality, that could not be further from the truth. So let's think about you, right? How do you learn in the classroom, right? Um, I always think of these painting and wine classes. I don't know if any of you have ever taken one. But when you walk in, they have a big painting up on the wall, and it'll be like a replica of Monet, right? And you sit there and you think about it, and they say, hey, go ahead and paint it, right? How many of us would be able to actually do that? None, right? Or majority of us wouldn't be able to. So what they do is they give you modifications, right? They take this complicated painting and they break it down step by step, and they teach you how to do segment by segment, and they make it simple for you so that you can work, and before you know it, you end up with this beautiful painting. That's what we do in special education for students with intellectual disabilities, right? Simple modifications take this complex lesson and breaks it down so that it's accessible for everyone, right? Um, so the point is that we use modifications and accommodations on a daily basis too. Um, so let's not use that as an excuse to exclude our students with intellectual disabilities from the general education classroom. Um, Another example is if you have the summer off and you wanted to take a master class with Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? He's talking about astrophysics, black holes, all sorts of space terms. How many of us are going to understand and really grasp everything he's saying? Yeah, majority of us would only grasp a small portion of this complex curriculum, right? But does that mean that it's not worth taking? No, you're going to walk away with something, right? Even if you walk away learning one new thing, it's worth it. So this is what we have to remember when we talk about students with intellectual disabilities in our general education classrooms, particularly when we're talking about higher grade levels in elementary school, um, as well as high school level classes. Um, the content might be a little bit out of reach, especially when it has a lot of abstract thinking. But that doesn't mean that student won't walk away with something meaningful and having learned something. Um, so we really need to keep that in mind for our students. When we talk about students with particularly Down syndrome, their issues primarily come down to these two things, right? Motor planning and sensory processing. So what is motor planning? Motor planning is a skill that allows you to perform big motor movements every day, right? It's your physical activities, it's your gross and fine motor skills, right? It's your running, your jumping, your handwriting, sensory processing. It's the ability to take in all the senses around you, organize them, filter them, realize which senses that you need to take in, um, and then respond appropriately and spit out some sort of output. Um, in Down syndrome, this is where the interplay between these two things is where we really have an issue. So motor planning challenges in Down syndrome really come down to something called hypotonia. Hypotonia is a fancy word for low muscle tone. Every person with Down syndrome has hypotonia to varying degrees, right? It makes your muscles really, really floppy and they have a lot less tension. It affects your posture, it affects your speech, and makes you really fatigue very, very easily. I don't know what it's like to have low muscle tone, but what I imagine it to be like is, you know how exhausted you feel if you go to like Disney World for the day and you're running around all day, and at the end of the day you sit down and you are exhausted and everything hurts. Um, Hypotonia isn't painful, but it's that feeling of fatigue, and really, really loose, exhausted muscles. And it affects kids on their day-to-day basis, especially in the classroom. It takes them a lot more effort and thought to provide everyday activities that we take for granted. Um, an example is if a child is learning their ABCs and they're working on their handwriting at the same time, you know, other children might be able to multitask, whereas a child with Down syndrome might be using their, really focusing on their motor planning to perfect that writing that capital B, right? And it's that issue with focusing on two things that could be a challenge. Particularly with new activities, kids need to use a lot more of their brain power to execute that activity. Uh, the best way I can explain it is, when you go home tonight, is to try brushing your teeth with your non-dominant hand. It is way more difficult than you would realize. If you brush your teeth with your regular hand, you don't think about it. You are thinking about what you have to do tomorrow or that day. You're doing 10 different things at the same time. You might be ordering something off of Amazon, who knows, you're doing multiple things. But if you're brushing with your non-dominant hand, you can literally, that's all that you can think about is what you're doing. So we really need to keep this in mind when you're watching a child with Down syndrome in your classroom, and if you see them slouching or you see them really focusing on one little thing, don't interpret that again as a cognitive issue. It's really that they're taking a little bit longer to master that task due to their motor planning. The other issue is sensory integration. Again, it's how your brain organizes the information that it's receiving from the outside world before it reacts appropriately. You and I, who do not have Down syndrome, are typically able to manage continuous flow of information and respond without thinking about it. But a child with Down syndrome may have some difficulty with this. They're not always as quickly able to sort through information and may become overloaded and sensitive to stimuli. Every child is different. Some children might be hyper responsive, which is when they're really overloaded. Their brain is overloaded and they short circuit. They can't really take anymore and they need a break. Other children are hypo responsive, which means that they may not register an input. Like, for example, like a lot of kids, like my daughter doesn't really have too much feeling around her mouth and chin, so a lot of times you have to press really hard before she like kind of registers that sensory input. Um, so this is, and I'm sorry, a lot of kids are a mixture of both. Particularly in Down syndrome, a lot of kids are hyper responsive to certain stimuli and hypo to others, and there's a combination, and you can get a lot of different mixture of those two. This is my daughter Lily, right? She is watching Bluey. I don't know if my picture here is blocking it. And I don't know if you guys have seen Bluey, but it's an amazing new cartoon on Disney, and my kids are big fans. So total honesty, right? If someone saw Lily sitting there and they saw her with this posture, right? Head back, tongue out. Um, Majority of people would assume that this is some sort of indication of her cognitive ability, right? They may think, oh, look, she's like not, sort of like a vegetable, for lack of a better word. But what's really going on, right? What's really going on is that there is an awesome new episode of Bluey where Bluey goes to a place called Hammertown, which is like a fake Home Depot. It is brand new. It's awesome. She is totally engrossed in this new episode. All she cares about is what's going on that TV. So don't be fooled. Don't be fooled by this posture. She knows everything that's going on. She is registering everything that Bluey is saying. If her speech communication were where it's supposed to be, she would be telling you exactly what's happening. But here's what's going on. She can't process all that new, cool sensory information that she's getting from Bluey and hold her muscle tone in at the same time. Right? So her system's overloaded and her muscle tone goes out the window. But again, it just goes to show you, don't see the posture and indicate that as cognitive ability. The cognition is there, right? She's completely comprehending everything that's going on. It's just that she can't pull herself together at the same time. If you think about it, we do the exact same thing, right? So let's talk about how well how you do in certain situations with your motor planning and sensory processing. All right, so let's take the example of driving, right? Let's look at driving in 3 different scenarios. So let's say you're driving to work, right? This scene was originally for school administrators and principals, so I apologize if this isn't applicable to you, but if it is and you're driving to school to see these beautiful faces on a Monday morning, you don't think about it, right? You hop in the car, you have your coffee, you're making your right hand turn, your left hand turns. If you're me, you're calling your husband to take out the trash, stopping at a red light to order stuff off of Amazon, which I don't recommend. I'm just saying you're multitasking. You're writing your to-do list. You are not thinking about how you're getting to work. You just know how to do it. You're on autopilot. Your motor planning and sensory processing are low, right? You got this down. Okay, now what if you're driving in New York City? Now I can bash it because this is my hometown, but you need awareness, right? You're not driving in the Philadelphia suburbs anymore. You're in New York, a little bit more complicated, right? You have the taxi drivers cutting you off. You have people jumping out in front of you, trying to walk across the street. You have the delivery bikers. You're in Times Square. There's lights and noises, and it's just too much, right? It's a little bit more sensory processing, and you're probably going to be exhausted when you get home back to your house in Philadelphia, right? We all know how that feels. So this is what our kids go through, right? So this is probably like a typical day at school for a kiddo with Down syndrome. A little bit more sensory and motor planning, right? And they're tired at the end of the day, but they still made it through, right? Now, what about if you're driving in London? Forget it, right? My husband keeps referencing this 80s movie that I don't really know. Clark Griswold, European Vacation, right? He's stuck in the circle for like 5 hours, saying, kids, look, it's Big Ben again, right? You're driving on the wrong side of the road, the wheel's on the other side of the road, they're talking in accents, you have no idea where you're going. Your motor planning is gone, right? You have to think about everything you're doing, every turn, every lane change, sensory processing is gone. You are totally short-circuiting, overloaded. Can you still drive in London? Yes, right? That's our message. So this is how a kiddo with Down syndrome feels when they're given new information at school, right? Like let's say you're in second grade and you're doing double-digit subtraction, right? That child can do that math, but they may be having a sensory and motor planning overload, and it's going to take a little bit more to get there. Same as you driving in New York City, same as you driving in London. You can do it. It's just going to take a little bit more time and effort. So, walk away is we all have sensory processing and motor planning issues, just all on a different level. Really quickly, this could be its own presentation about difficulties in speech and Down syndrome. Um, you know, uh, but we really just wanted to briefly touch upon it. There's a huge discrepancy in Down syndrome between receptive and expressive understanding, right? So typically, a child with Down syndrome, their reception is through the roof. They understand everything that you are saying, and if you were testing it, most likely it's in the normal range, right? The issue is an expressive communication. Um, they have difficulty with the motor planning, putting the words out there. So, for example, like my daughter Lily, right? My daughter Lily knows the word cat. She can sign the word cat. She can physically say the word cat. She knows that you're talking about a cat, right? But her motor planning in her brain just has difficulty spinning that word, telling her mouth, which is a big muscle if you think about it, right? Putting the tongue where it's supposed to be to make those sounds and spit it out. The main difficulty that you see is with apraxia and articulation, all because your mouth and tongue are one big muscle, and it goes back to that motor planning. So they have issues with producing speech sounds, and essentially it results in speech that's difficult to understand, which is speech intelligibility. And we affectionately call it the Down syndrome accent. Um, and again, the motor plan can result in a slow speech response, but the walkaway is do not let that Down syndrome accent or slow verbal response fool you. It is not an indication of their cognitive ability. Talk to them and treat them like any other child because they are understanding everything that you're saying. It's just that they're having a hard time with that output. Really briefly, a lot of kids, particularly younger kids with Down syndrome, use an AAC device, right? That could be ASL sign language, or it could be an actual AAC device on hardware, like an iPad, right? It's very useful for someone who can't always rely on their natural speech to express what they want to say. And kids really take to it. Kids with Down syndrome tend to be very strong visual learners. So it really helps them bridge that gap because it's very concrete. My daughter uses touch chat, and it's very cool because it has the word there and the picture. So for something abstract like the word more, it makes it a little bit more concrete because it has the picture that goes with it. It's worked wonders, and it really reduces the pressure to produce those words in kids who have apraxia. I think it is. Okay, sorry. I just gave away what I was going to ask, but who are two people who come to mind when we think about AAC users? I flashed it, so you guys probably know the answer. But Helen Keller and Stephen Hawking, right? Helen Keller used ASL, and Stephen Hawking used an AAC device. But what's interesting about Stephen Hawking, and this is what I really want you to walk away with and kind of stick in your mind. We knew Stephen Hawking was a genius because Stephen Hawking's disease progression did not happen until later in life. He already proved himself a genius before he lost his ability to verbally communicate, right? But let's be honest, if Stephen Hawking came into your office, what would in this state, in this picture, what would your reaction be? Large majority of us would assume that he had low cognitive ability, right? As a society, we do this with nonverbal people. And we really have to be aware of what we've been taught and unlearn it, because this cannot be further from the truth, right? Imagine if Stephen Hawking um, were 15, right? When his disease progression started. And can you imagine having this brilliant brain and not being able to communicate effectively if, especially if he didn't have an AAC? So the point is that we really need to stop shortchanging people with intellectual disabilities, um, and people with disabilities who have difficulty with verbal communication, and treat them like everyone else. Um, and as a society, we really struggle with this, and in Catholic education in Philadelphia, we're really struggling with this as well. So that's what we're here for with RTA. Um, we want to show you that you are in great company if you choose to join us and hop into the world of inclusive education. This is a picture of our first professional development in August of 2021 with a brilliant group from about 5 different schools, all who had and currently have a student with Down syndrome enrolled. And it's wonderful. We're all here to help you. You are not alone. Um, and what we want you to remember too is we spend so much time teaching a child with disabilities how to interact with others, but we really need to stop, especially with a Catholic mindset, and say, why don't we spend time teaching those without disabilities how to interact with children with disabilities, right? Yeah, we have a long way to go with this. But you have to keep in mind, emotional intelligence is the number one quality in leaders, right? There are many books written about this, and I can tell you from firsthand experience that children with disabilities have emotional intelligence in spades. Not only do they have it themselves, but they're great teachers of it. So we really need to be capitalizing on them. And not only can we learn so much from them, but other children without disabilities will really be the winners in all this, because they will walk away um, more aware of social justice issues, as well as realizing that people with disabilities are just regular people, and we really need to stop othering them. Um, and right now we have the next generation of leaders in our classroom, and we can really make a huge impact for future generations. We really want to keep in mind that Pope Francis always says inclusion should be the first rock on which we should build our house. So we really hope that you'll join us in this great progression towards inclusive education and Catholic education. If you're watching online, please check us out. We are the Rising Together Alliance. Our web address is risingtogetheralliance.org. And please feel free to share this video and reach out to us with any questions. Our email is risingtogetheralliance@gmail.com. It's been a pleasure being with you guys. I hope next time it's in person. And if you have any questions, please do reach out. Thanks so much.